Hi, I'm Andrus, and alongside my co-author Alice Xiang, we will be discussing our work exploring the challenges that fairness practitioners face around collecting and using demographic data. So most algorithmic fairness and bias auditing techniques require a sensitive category variable to make comparisons across groups, but this requirement poses a serious threat to algorithmic fairness's usability, as we'll explore in this work. And so, for our purposes, we use this phrase demographic data to refer to data about sensitive category membership, which kind of includes legally defined protected classes, as well as special categories and less regulated classes that are still of interest to fairness practitioners. And so, to briefly illustrate how core of a requirement demographic data is to algorithmic fairness, imagine, for example, you're kind of just getting into the space and you're trying to figure out how to use some fairness techniques within your own work. And you go online and you find all of these tools that kind of outline how to do things, but they all require access to demographic data, which in this instance you do not have. And so you go looking for tools that don't require demographic data, and maybe you find some that use simulations, but nothing that lets you use your own data. But prior work has kind of shown that demographic data is rarely accessible in practice. So there's a bit of a disconnect between the methods that are available to practitioners and the data that they actually have. And so kind of what we wanted to explore with this work is what happens when a machine learning practitioner wants to use demographic data to assess bias or unfairness in a system, and kind of like what factors cause the most difficulties for practitioners who are trying to use demographic data in this way. And so briefly, to explore this, we conducted a set of semi-structured interviews with 38 participants from many different organizations in various regions. And these participants came from many different types of roles in different sectors. And yeah, we kind of just were trying to explore kind of in a broad sense, like what the experience looks like of encountering and using demographic data. And in order to recruit our participants, we relied at first on the Partnership on AI network, but then we also kind of expanded our search through LinkedIn and identifying folks that had worked on algorithmic fairness and kind of bias auditing, a bunch of different kind of related areas. We also used organizational publications to identify people who are working in these areas. And then we also had folks share our call more broadly with their network. And so, yeah, if you look here at our participant profiles, kind of just like what sectors people were from and what roles they were in, we really tried to kind of go cross-sector and cross-disciplinary to just kind of get a kind of at least a broad view of what's going on in practice. Yeah, and so now I'll let Alice jump in for discussing some findings.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alice Xiang, and I'll be speaking through the first part of our interview findings. So overall, what we found was that overwhelmingly, our participants had encountered various obstacles to both the collection and the usage of demographic data in service of fairness goals. So we divided these challenges into two separate categories. So first off, there were legal and organizational constraints. So these were often constraints that the practitioners faced coming from the legal team, compliance team, business teams, so on and so forth. In addition to that, though, practitioners themselves also expressed significant concerns around how they could ensure that the data they were collecting was being collected in a responsible way, captured all of the relevant demographic categories, and also would only be used for fairness purposes. So first, I'll talk through the legal and organizational constraints that our practitioners experienced. So the first major category of constraints was around privacy laws and policies. So, by and large, in many tech companies, privacy is a much more developed area of compliance than fairness is. Fairness and bias mitigation of algorithms is a relatively new area. And so, whereas there's a lot of consciousness about the need for privacy protections around data and often entire teams devoted to privacy, the same could not be said for fairness. And so this created some challenges given that there are significant regulatory barriers to collecting demographic data, especially if you don't have appropriate informed consent. In fact, one of our participants stated that every time they do an algorithmic assessment, people ask them, "Where's race?" Because by and large, what we heard from practitioners is that it's hard to get access to any demographic data. And if you do get access to demographic data, it's probably going to be gender and age rather than race. And so, whereas you can build some sort of bias auditing system around gender and age, for the most part, it's really hard to do so for race. And this is also related to the ethos of GDPR and privacy by design, where the goal from a privacy perspective is to not collect more data than is necessary. And so for practitioners that are working on algorithmic bias, often they need to advocate for why collecting demographic data is necessary in their particular case. As one practitioner we spoke to put it, "I think the combination of GDPR and the ethos that GDPR lives in, which is an ethos of tech fear, nervousness, and lack of trust, is a big blocker." So, in addition to privacy laws and policies, there were also concerns related to anti-discrimination laws and policies. So, first off, the regulations in this space vary widely across both sectors and geographies. So, for example, whereas in HR and employment, there might be for example, in HR and employment, there are often pre-existing guidelines that require the collection of demographic data for discrimination auditing purposes. But what we found is that where there was not clear anti-discrimination law regulations or norms around collecting demographic data, it was often considered to be riskier to collect such data rather than to simply ignore the possibility of algorithmic discrimination. As one of our participants put it, "I think there's always this sort of balancing test that our lawyers are applying, which is weighing whether the benefits of being proactive about testing for bias outweigh the risks associated with this leaking or becoming scooped up in some sort of litigation." So the concern here was that if we have no need to actually test our products for bias, but we do collect this data and do test for bias, then does that open the door for then further discrimination liability because now we have a paper trail about having discovered bias in our system? So one of our proposals as a result in this case is that it's important to have more consistent and clear anti-discrimination policies to inform the standardization and normalization of demographic data collection processes. And this is especially important in that oftentimes anti-discrimination policies simply reflect this notion that we need to treat everyone equally or treat everyone the same. But when it comes to trying to debias an algorithm, oftentimes that does involve some degree of differential treatment, which in turn raises further legal questions. So aside from the legal constraints, there were also financial and organizational constraints that practitioners raised. So for instance, mitigating bias or algorithmic fairness is often not a key performance indicator in and of itself. And so for practitioners in this space, often they had to argue for why this is important, even if it conflicted with other KPIs and can be quite costly in and of itself. In addition, practitioners often were not empowered to ensure that the appropriate data collection and bias detection processes were in place. There were often existing data collection processes that the fairness practitioners then had to try to influence, which was often an uphill battle. Finally, there were concerns about negative PR around the data collection processes. So there were concerns, for example, that if a tech company did decide it wanted to audit its systems for bias and, say, collect data on race, then asking its user base what race they were would stoke significant negative PR given the lack of trust given a lot of the lack of trust around large tech companies, given the lack of trust around tech companies collecting user data, particularly sensitive user data. So now I'll turn things back to McCain to talk through some of the concerns that the practitioners themselves had around demographic data.
So a very common set of practitioner concerns that we heard kind of revolved around this question of like kind of the reliability of data collection efforts. And so looking first at self-reported or self-identified demographics, it's perhaps not surprising that one of the most common concerns was just like low response rates to ask for demographic data. And kind of similarly, when folks did respond, there was a fair amount of concern around kind of whether they did so accurately, and if it was really kind of even in their interest to do so, and kind of how we could change things on that front. And finally, practitioners were also worried that the categories themselves were perhaps defined inconsistently or used inconsistently in the analysis process. And so, kind of turning to one of the examples from our conversations with folks, one participant said, "I'm still very, very careful whenever I talk about gender analyses to be really clear about what exactly we're seeing here, because custom gender does not mean non-binary. Unknown gender does not mean the person opted to not give it to us." And so, here you really don't want to make kind of the incorrect conclusions based off of a kind of an incoherent category. And so moving to kind of inferred demographics and proxy. So, there are many cases where the data is not available, or directly collecting demographic data is not an option. And as such, it might be recommended that the data should be inferred. But quite widely across the participant pool, we heard a lot of significant concerns around the accuracy of inference, as well as the kind of like privacy and dignity risk of inferring these sensitive categories. And yeah, so for this reason, many practitioners couldn't even really imagine using inference as a practical strategy for data procurement. But that being said, we also talked with a number of practitioners in domains where inferring demographics was pretty pervasive and actually kind of normalized and even recommended by regulators. And so kind of an interesting case that we heard of is that practitioners will somewhat begrudgingly use proxies as a weak signal for deeper underlying discrimination or issues in their models. So if practitioners can't collect the data that is kind of required to look at a likely axis of discrimination, then that's when they'll kind of turn to these loosely related variables that they're like, if there's like a big enough issue here, it's probably indicative of a broken model or something. And so then we can use that not to like tweak the model, but to go back, to encourage us to go back and kind of delve deeper into it. Yeah, and then kind of finally here, another difficulty just kind of arises when inferred attributes are kind of actually more relevant to the issue at hand than self-reported ones. And yeah, and so kind of taking a step back, we did hear from participants that there is often this discomfort and uncertainty around what groups warrant attention and how those groups should even really be defined. Kind of a big question here is, who should identify the relevant demographic attributes? Should it be the practitioners, some other outside experts? One participant described how the step of asking, what demographic slices are most relevant is very difficult to get an answer to because almost nobody feels like they have the authority to say these are the ones that matter. You're kind of justifying that comment, right? Maybe like another practitioner said, I often think that the way we approach this is very US centric, that our understanding of what demographic characteristics would be relevant in other countries and cultures is pretty rudimentary. And another salient question that comes up here is whether, like, are these attribute categories sufficient to detect the kinds of discrimination that practitioners are looking for? One participant, when discussing U.S. Census categories, mentioned that the categories were defined back in the 60s, and they're a rather poor breakdown of our population. And yeah, you just it can happen where the categories in use in practice, right, just like don't allow you to interrogate what you would like to. And kind of finally on this point, there is this kind of more meta question as well of like, are practitioners going to be empowered to focus on the most salient forms of discrimination to their work? One participant recalled how there was a case where, or multiple cases where they had data. They actually had the data about certain groups, but that type of discrimination that they were delving into was not a type that their organization was really worried about. And as they were told by the policy team, we don't have a specific policy about this, so why are you testing for it? And yeah, so some practitioners as well kind of wanted to call attention to the kind of the relationship between data subjects and organizations, and felt like there should be more work kind of done there before we kind of ramp up any future demographic data collection efforts. And so one of the elements here that they thought should be improved on is the actual kind of like the trustworthiness of the data collection process. And so that, data subjects should be well informed of the intended use cases at the time of collection, and that from there, those use cases should be adhered to. And yeah, kind of following up on that, right? Like maybe some practitioners even suggested maybe having kind of a more like transparent use case scenario where like data subjects get report backs about how their data was used, and then kind of finally, and perhaps most extreme of these, we did see some desire for data subjects to actually have a say in how their data is mobilized if it is going to be collected. And so in other words, if you recognize that a system is working poorly for some demographic, how do you rectify that in a way that meaningfully pays attention and gives voice to the group that it's not working for? And finally, practitioners, are not always confident that demographic data should be collected or used, kind of as drawn out by the previous section. But we also found that this was especially true if they are uncertain about what will happen after they conduct their fairness assessments. So, we heard practitioners express doubts such as, will algorithmic fairness solutions be effective here? What does it look like to deploy them in practice? Does this problem even have a technical solution? And, perhaps more deeply, right? Like, will the owners of the system support meaningfully addressing uncovered issues? Kind of expanding on this, as one practitioner put it, I would like to make a little bit stronger of a stand on being anti-bias. Instead of just making sure our models aren't biased, we should potentially carve out a space for treating groups differently and treating the historically marginalized groups with more care. And so moving forward, I think it's important that we kind of do justice to the interconnectedness of algorithmic fairness and these data requirements, and kind of acknowledge the social, ethical, legal, and political challenges that come along with categorization and sensitive data collection. And so, yeah, like what can we do to kind of move forward on this? We don't think that it's really possible to, for there to be like a silver bullet that can just like resolve all of these constraints and concerns that we explored in this work. But we do think it is possible through kind of like consistent and coordinated efforts across domains that we can start moving towards something akin to responsible demographic data procurement and use. And so one of the directions that we would like to kind of start pushing this work forward in is enabling accountable demographic data use. And one promising proposal in this direction that we've kind of seen is the actual enlisting of trusted third parties for data collection and storage, like third parties that are committed to transparency and consent, and possibly even community leadership or community ownership. And kind of through this tool, data subjects kind of understand a bit more what their data is being used for, and have more opportunities to engage with the work. And we think this is kind of likely to create the conditions for what one participant referred to as data donation, which is really kind of just this understanding that if participants or if data subjects are bought into the work, bought into the goal of data collection, then it is far more likely that they will actually be willing to share their data towards that end. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this talk. And please reach out if you're interested in our work, in this work or future work. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.